Everybody see that? Just a nod. Thank you. We'll give everyone a few minutes to arrive. Okay, so as people start to trickle in, just to notify everyone that this session is going to be recorded, and the recording will be available to view on the RAI's YouTube channel. So hi again, everyone. I am Alice Kelly. I am currently a fellow in residence at the Rothermere American Institute, that's the RAI I mentioned, at the University of Oxford. I'm a literary and media scholar, and I've been working on fem/fanfiction. So those terms will be familiar to many of you who are joining us today, but I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the key terms we might be thinking about in a little minute. So the first thing I wanted to do is to thank my friend Esther, who is kindly helping with the technical side of things again. So thank you, Esther. And then just to say how excited I am to welcome our incredible speakers today and all of you. So as with last week, I'm going to, as I said, give a brief introduction, go over some of the terms, think about the theory, try and explain why I wanted to do this series in the first place, and then I will introduce our speakers. So we've got two 15-minute presentations from Sarah Sinwell and Emily Kocher, and then we'll have about 25 minutes for a Q&A. So as everybody's sharing, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat. I'll try and keep on top of them, or you can obviously raise your hand, use the raise hand function at the end. Okay, so again, this is very similar to, well, exactly the same as last week. So here are just some key terms. I'm not going to repeat word for word what I said last week. The recording of last week's session is now on YouTube. So if any of this, if I go too quickly, if any of this is confusing, then please do feel free to check that out. But to explain what we mean by transformative fandom, that transformative fan works are artworks that fans create using pre-existing characters from copyrighted media. Shipping fandom is a huge part of transformative fandom. So that's fandom that's for specific relationships or ships, and would be fan works between particular characters. So as I said, my research is on fem/fan works, which describes female to female relationships, and then you can see on screen / male to male. Okay, I'm just going to enable the transcription. You can see that totally threw me. I'm not sure how effective it's going to be as I mumble a great deal, so apologies. So in Archives of Desire last week, we were talking about the limitations that are on the spaces in which we find these works. And this week, we're going to be talking about how fan-made memory relates to other kinds of queer memory making or queer memories. So, as I said last week, the theory behind this seminar series comes from Rogue Archives, which is a book I highly recommend to any fan scholars who are unaware of it. Abigail de Kosnik argues in Rogue Archives that writing and reading fan fiction constitutes acts of remembrance, and that the places that we find fan fiction and fan works generally are aggregators of fans' remembrances. De Kosnik also argues in Rogue Archives that these fan spaces are innately queer, because even when you have heterosexual women writing about heterosexual relationships, female fans are queering themselves because they're identifying with male characters. They are queering female characters anytime they depict them as more empowered than they are in the source text, and they're engaging in queer relations because they're sharing their work of romantic and sexual fiction for other women, genderqueer or non-binary people. So fundamentally, we're thinking about how fan works and the spaces where we engage with fandom can be both innately memorializing, recording how we feel about media, and also innately queer in that they're troubling gender and sexuality norms. But today, specifically, we're thinking about, as I said, how fan-made memory can relate to media-made queer memory, to official versions of queer memory on screen. We're also thinking about how queer memories in fan works might relate to other spaces and mediums of queer history. And we've got two really fantastic and very exciting talks today on the histories that we might think about when we're thinking about queer fan memory. So we're going to start with Sarah Sinwell, who is an associate professor in the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah. She has published essays on green porno, BoJack Horseman, and mysterious skin in Women's Studies Quarterly, Jump Cut, and Asexuality's Feminist and Queer Perspectives. Examining shifting modes of independent film distribution and exhibition on YouTube, Hulu, Netflix, and Sundance TV, her book, Indie Cinema Online, redefines independent cinema in an era of media convergence. Sarah teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses, including diversity in film and media, women directors, queer media, independent cinema, and convergence cultures. So I will stop sharing my screen and you can take it away, Sarah.
Let me just share my own screen. Can everyone see that? Wonderful, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me to this panel, Alice. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Emily, I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. Before I begin, I just wanted to, again, thank you all for coming here. This is an ongoing project, so I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation that happens afterwards. And I'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which I live and work. I'd like to acknowledge the Shoshone, Goshute, Paiute, and Ute tribes. And I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation today. So the topic of my paper today is Glance Choreography and Grazing Fingers, Excavating Fandom of Queer Female Historical Period Dramas. I'm just trying to turn the page here. There we go. Okay, so perhaps a lot of you are familiar with this Saturday Night Live sketch that just came out in 2021 about lesbian period dramas, where they talk about Another film that isn't afraid to ask, will these lesbians be lesbians together? And they also talk about films such as Ammonite and Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and focus on the use of glance choreography, the wind, and grazing fingers, as the short draws attention to the tendency of these period films to feature white, straight actresses in queer roles and direction by men, especially in the case of Ammonite. At the same time, it also points to the ways in which queer female fandoms are invited to search for themselves within these historical period dramas. Excavating the ways in which film and television series such as Ammonite, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Anne with an E, and Dickinson explore these representations of queer, bisexual, and LGBTQIA female identities, this paper will look at what happens when fans and audiences are invited to reimagine historical understandings of both femininity and queerness. So here, I will draw attention to the absence of LGBTQIA characters within media histories more generally, but also point to the ways in which these representations are limited to cis, femme, and white readings of queer femininity and female intimacy, as they both limit and open up the possibilities for more inclusive queer female histories. Sorry, I'm just getting used to the way these slides are working. Okay, so here's some examples of those histories. Of course, we have Carol, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Ammonite, and Gentleman Jack. But today I'll be talking more about Dickinson and Anne with an E. But I just wanted to kind of bring up these other films, especially that Saturday Night Live skit explicitly refers to. And I also would like to kind of reference Kate McNicholas-Smith's work in Lesbians on Television, which just came out in the past year or so, and the ways in which she talks about how the history of queer representation is, on one level, a story of invisibility. So I think one of the other things that's being pointed out in the sketch, as well as in all of these examples we're referring to, is drawing attention to that representation and the ways in which the visibility, even in these posters, is significant. So these historical television series, such as Anne with an E and Dickinson, bring queer narratives into both the past and the present, as they center upon queer female actresses and identities. And that's one of the reasons I was so interested, particularly in these two texts, is because they're really trying to modernize the story of Anne of Green Gables and Emily Dickinson's narrative. So that's one of the reasons I was interested in it. And for this discussion today is how the history is brought into the past, as well as brought into the present. So as Moya Luckett notes in her work on period dramas, they're structurally complex but easily understood, multi-perspectival, realist, and very similar narratives. These foster identification, helping bridge past and present, while their visual details both foreground historical gaps and attract female viewers by evoking their presumed competence in emotion, understanding of fashion, and overall visual literacy. And here again, you can see in these images, but also in the images that I'll be showing from Dickinson and Anne with an E, how this references to emotion, interestingly fashion, and I think also hair in a lot of these cases, and visual literacy kind of come into the fore. So here you can see another piece that was recently written in Vulture, How to Tell If You're in a Serious Lesbian Period Romance. And again, all these questions: do you feel confined by the expectations of your era? Are your desires repressed? Again, this concept of the fabric, the beach, the wind, all of these kind of tropes coming into place when you think about these examples, again, using the imagery from Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Ammonite. But these films and series are not only significant because of their queer and female love stories, but also because of their female-centric and queer modes of cinematic style and visual and oral storytelling. So here I kind of refer back to the work of directors such as Chantal Akerman of Jean Diamant or Jane Campion with The Piano and Sweetie, and how these kind of texts both reinforce and push the boundaries of representations of femininity and female and queer desire. So defying these conventions of the gaze from Mulvey's seminal essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, these films and series incorporate alternatives to the gaze, such as glancing and staring, and create a queer gaze despite their tendencies to be both white and defined by those class differences. And here I think we can look at the work of Lisa Henderson in her work on the class character of the gaze in her book, Love and Money. We can also look at Nicolas Villier's work on the glance and the stare. And again, thinking about how that works in relationship again, to these images we're seeing here, as well as how we understand the relationships between these historical characters. So here we have an image of Anne with an E, the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, and Netflix series from 2017 to 2019. And one of the things that these fans of Anne with an E talk about, again, this concept of the kindred spirit is often used, the relationship between Anne and Diana that you see here, and how fans kind of posit that Anne with an E is in fact a bisexual character. So I think this is also something, if you watch the series, interestingly with Anne with an E, the series focused much more time and energy on the relationships between Anne and Diana than it does with her and Gilbert Blythe, just in terms of the time that they're on screen, but also in terms of how we engage with those relationships and those characters. Whereas in the case of Dickinson, in even just the first episode of the series, Emily kisses and declares her love for her best friend, Sue Gilbert. So again, there's no, they're not kind of putting it under the rug that Emily Dickinson is in love with her best friend. Instead, they're putting it right out there in the very first episode. So this is significant, especially since many of these lesbian and queer romances that focus on queer femininity represent female intimacy through the slow burn, the passing glance, the brief touch, as we see in films like Carol, Ammonite, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So here I want to focus a little bit more about the history of queer women in television period dramas, and then I want to turn to a discussion of Dickinson and Anne with an E, and talk about how these shows reimagine queer female histories, and then I'll examine how these shows both open up and limit the possibilities for queer female representation on period television. So historical TV series such as Gentleman Jack, Anne with an E, and Dickinson bring these queer narratives into both the past and the present as they center upon these queer female historical figures, their subjectivities and identities. So in this context, exploring the possibilities for representing queer femininity includes not only casting queer identified stars, but also enables these stories to unfold over time through multiple episodes. And again, this contrasts with the idea that you introduce a character in a single, quote, very special episode, rather than drawing on these characters through multiple episodes. In the series I'll be discussing today, they definitely refer to these relationships over multiple episodes and multiple seasons. So historical TV dramas are particularly rich site for representing these interrelationships. And I think that's one of the things that these series do differently from films such as Ammonite and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. They have a lot more time to create these relationships because of the fact that they're serial television. So as Moya Luckett notes, unlike masculinity, which is conventionally seen in terms of an illusory false stability, the feminine is upheld as historically variable and contingent, making the period drama a rich site for exploring popular understandings of womanhood while effectively parsing its relationship to the present. And this is what brings me here to Dickinson. And actually, kind of the inspiration for this project was just upon the first episode of Dickinson, the ways in which it plays with Emily's relationship with her best friend Sue, the way it draws attention to this queerness from the very first episode, and how Emily is enabled to explore this relationship out of multiple episodes and multiple seasons. At the same time, these historical television dramas also draw upon what Gilad Pava calls queer nostalgia, a creative practice that creates new fields, dimensions, and perspectives of the queer experience. And again, the examples of Anne with an E and Dickinson, I think, draw upon our nostalgia for the character of Anne of Green Gables, for Emily Dickinson, but also kind of reframe how we can imagine those stories and those identities. So for instance, Dickinson merges past histories with present day culture by featuring the music of contemporary female pop stars such as Billie Eilish and Lizzo, and inserting contemporary and often foul language within the storytelling, despite its apparent incongruity within that historical context. And as Emmanuel Levy has argued in Cinema of Outsiders, the real issue is not so much gay content as gay sensibility, the gay look, and how gays and lesbians perceive and dissect Hollywood movies, and how they read films against the grain, looking for meanings not just in the text and the subtext. In fact, in Dickinson, this enables a reimagining of traditional understandings of literary and queer histories by placing Emily and Sue's queer relationship in both the text itself as well as the subtext. So And this is, again, here's some images. The hashtag Emmy Sue has come to the fore in terms of thinking about the relationships between Emily and Sue. And here's some of the images that the fans repost from the series. Again, the inclusion of these queer characters beyond the single episode also enables these characters to break traditional stereotypes associated with historical gay characters, such as the spinster, the flamboyant designer, the reclusive next door neighbor. And these television dramas also create a space for the construction of queerness and sexuality that uses open-ended narratives and expanded timeframes. And again, the use of flashbacks, the use of the play, again, with fashion, and the play with kind of imagery that you see on screen here is a good example. So here, I'd like to reference Maria Sanfilippo's work on bisexuality in contemporary film and television, as many people have argued that Emily is bisexual. So where the default to status quo structure of episode television and the contained temporality of feature films create a pressure to resolve questions of sexuality, the narrative open-endedness and expanded time frame that characterizes serial television offers a particularly promising site for mounting long-range and multifaceted explorations into bisexual characters' identities and experiences. Television narrative encourages bisexual representation by permitting it to unfold over time, necessary for the accumulation of experiences that renders bisexuality not practically viable for any individual as potentially bisexual, no matter his or her behaviors, but rather representationally legible. And here I think you can see that example on the screen. This is an image of the Anne with an E campaign since the series has been canceled. I think it's really interesting to look at the fans of Anne with an E draw attention not just to the representation of LGBTQ identity, but Indigenous histories, racism, censorship, classism, that these are all issues that the series is addressing, and that fans are really interested in the intersections between these identities. So focusing on the relationship between Anne and Diana has enabled many fans to posit that Anne is in fact bisexual. And Anne's queer kinship with Diana is perhaps more important than her romance with Gilbert, especially since in the series, Gilbert's relationship with Bash, his Trinidadian friend, also seems to take precedence over his romance with Anne. And it's only in the last few episodes of the final season that Anne's romantic interest in Gilbert blooms. And in fact, Gilbert woos another woman throughout that season named Winifred. So again, the show is, I think, drawing attention to the fact that Anne's relationship with Diana is much more significant for her, and kind of the relationship between Anne and Gilbert is nowhere near as important as the introduction of the Bash character or as the growing friendship between Anne and Diana. So these historical television dramas also create a space for female and queer fans to expand on these narratives by sharing their own readings of the literary and historical gaps in the series. As Luckett has noted, historical TV dramas typically have a greater impact on public understandings of the past than books, costume movies, and nonfiction television, because they're more widely seen, often more emotionally engaging and accessible, and of longer duration, which prolongs public interest and debate. So in the case of Anne with an E, these elements of the drama have led to the creation of this fan community known as Anne Nation, committed to renewing the show ever since it was canceled, but also fostering the relationship among fans. And again, drawing attention to that these fans are of all ages, all demographics. And a lot of these fans have constructed their own imaginings of Anne's letters, her poems. They talk about, quote, the lost letters of Avonlea. They share recipes from the cookbook that they imagine that these fans have created. And then in the case of Emily Dickinson, they've again created this hashtag Emmy Sue to draw attention to that relationship between Emily and Sue. So in conclusion, here's some fan art I've commissioned from some children in my life to talk about. I was really interested in how children would engage with the Anne with an E narrative, and I asked them to think about the queer soiree episode, but any elements of Anne with an E that they referred to. I think this is kind of interesting commentary. So as Julia Himberg has argued, audiences and critics have searched for LGBTQ characters that are as multidimensional and complex as their heterosexual counterparts. These characters of Anne, Diana, Emily, and Sue are allowed to explore their love and relationships over the course of multiple seasons, rather than limiting these roles to only episode or confining their identities and sexualities to the stereotypes of only spinsters or reclusive next door neighbors. In fact, all of the characters conform to the aesthetics of female beauty and fashion throughout the series, and I think this kind of is evidence of that. And they put white and queer women at the center of these narratives and their stories. The inclusion of these queer characters and relationships beyond a single episode pushes the boundaries of historical representations of the past and enables alternative understandings of queer inclusivity in the past, present, and future. So though these episodes enable understandings of queer femininity through the multiple episodes, they're still limited to cis, femme, and white readings of queer femininity and female intimacy that both limit and open up possibilities for representing more inclusive queer pasts, presents, and futures on period television. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. That's brilliant. I love the artwork you commissioned as well. Okay, that was fantastic. Okay, so next up we have Emily Kocher, who is a PhD candidate in the University of Michigan's English and Women's and Gender Studies program. Her research has appeared in Legacy and Transformative Works and Cultures. There's actually a link to her TWC article in the chat. And she has spoken on fan podcasts about shows including Gentleman Jack and Supergirl. Her dissertation aims to recover a more robust history of working women, their communities, and their desires in 19th century American history through a too-close reading of labor periodicals, story papers, dime novels, and other genres of working class literature. So Emily, your turn.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Alice and Sarah, for that great paper, and to everyone here for attending. Like Sarah, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? Cool. All right, so today I'm going to bring us back, I think it'll go nicely with Sarah's. I'm going to bring us back to the actual source text from the 19th century. And I want to think with you all about modes of reading and textual engagement, particularly those fannish methods that have been derided as misreading, overreading, or just plain bad reading, and ask what they might be able to offer to scholars of queer history. Specifically, this talk presents a fan-inspired methodology I term too close reading, as a mode of approaching popular culture archives that have rarely been afforded the same granular, close attention that wealthy white literature and life writing have. Despite the ways that fandom all too frequently privileges white, cis characters, relationships, and histories in creating content, replicating existing structures of exclusion, I argue that fans' methods of excavating queerness nonetheless provide a useful model of reading and recovery. Too close reading emerged for me as one way of making legible working class women's queer subject performances, desires, and intimacies in 19th century American archives. Much scholarship has assumed that relationships between women in this period were largely a wealthy white phenomenon, a bias built into the framework of the romantic friendship paradigm from its foundations in the important early work of scholars like Carol Smith Rosenberg and Lillian Faderman. Other scholars have not only privileged the upper classes in narrating queer history, but have actively dismissed the possibility of intimacies among laboring women. I contend that these women were not precluded by virtue of their class from cultivating same-gender attachments or capacious gendered and sexual imaginaries, but instead formed and wrote about them in different rhetorical registers. Rather than flourishing in the domestic female world, working women's intimacies were imbricated in spaces of labor and inextricable from ongoing concerns about food, shelter, and other basic necessities that have been dismissed as incompatible with the loftier ideals of friendship and romance. Their desires are not often dignified in the kinds of sources scholars have drawn on to write histories of labor and queer intimacy. Yet I find tucked away in cheap 19th century periodicals that enjoyed both widespread popularity and deep derision, which for those of you who work in fandom, is this sounding familiar, traces of and testaments to the complex desires these women had for each other and the range of gendered performances they embodied, for the community networks they sustained with their fellow workers, and for the better futures they dreamed of cultivating. The problem of this sprawling archive then is less a lack of historical documentation as has been assumed, but rather one of legibility. And who better than fans, I ask, to model methods of recognizing those quieter, less obvious, perhaps even unintended traces of queerness in source texts? So what does it mean to read like a fan? To read fannishly, I suggest, is to be deeply invested in all that is on the page and particularly attuned to minute details and hints of queer possibilities that become clearer the closer one gets to the text and the larger universe in which it is situated. Against a disciplinary and disciplining tradition of critical reading that idealizes the putatively objective reader, too close reading foregrounds readerly affect, particularly desire. Indulging in fannish forms of consumption akin to what Lara Farina terms erotic reading, too close readers let themselves be, quote, moved by a text and feel its affective pull. Such readers linger in the details of texts not often deemed worthy of close study, scouring them for traces of a queerness they long to find. In collapsing the distance meant to remain between text and reader, even in typical close reading practices, too close readers risk the accusations that inhere in that impermissible excessive too. Like contemporary fans who are dismissed as projecting their own desires and identifying as romantic or erotic, interactions deemed platonic or even familial by showrunners and other viewers, too close readers open themselves to charges of indulging in uncritical reading, bad reading, or even misreading. Yet it's precisely this method's proximity to its objects that enables too close readers to notice the quieter moments of queer possibility that threaten to pass by unnoticed. Too close readers spin narratives of possibility from parentheticals, marginalia, and trace evidence. They venture into the territory of what might be true, finding the conditional to be just as fruitful as the indicative, the fleeting just as meaningful as the established. Inspired by Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, which in Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments allows her to narrate a different story about the ordinary Black women who have been for too long, quote, credited with nothing and deemed unfit for history, I offer this framework as a methodology for recognizing forms of queerness less readily identifiable under scholarly frameworks developed out of a wealthy white archive. Too close reading might also provide ways of conceptualizing how 19th century working women readers interacted in queer, fannish ways with cheap fiction. Insofar as reading, particularly the communal, public-facing forms of reading encouraged by the circulated, loaned, and reprinted sensation fiction, is a technology of subject formation, I ask what kinds of possibilities these texts might have opened for their readers. Might we begin piecing together a queer working class genealogy through analyzing this archive for the range of desires and gendered performances, many of which ran athwart middle class norms, that it presented to readers for enjoyment, certainly, but also potentially identification and emulation. To demonstrate what this kind of fannish archival approach might look like in practice, I'll turn today to story papers, an early iteration of the popular sensation fiction that emerged in the mid-19th century. Story papers were cheap 8-page weeklies that brought together original and reprinted fiction and poetry, news reporting, readers' correspondence, advice columns, and more. Described as being, quote, for the millions, they enjoyed widespread circulation through both regular subscribers and vast informal dissemination networks of lenders and borrowers. Their popularity, particularly among working class youth, raised concerns about the content of their stories and the sorts of messages they might send. Moral crusaders like Anthony Comstock, perhaps better known for some of his other moral crusades, condemned sensation fiction, and an 1879 editorial deemed it, quote, perverting literary trash. Although the story papers' serialized long-form fiction frequently reestablishes a social order thrown into pleasurable crisis for many long chapters, I contend that the unruliness of the serial form, which you can see just one of the sort of full-page spreads on the screen, and the conditions of its circulation undercut the teleological weight of such resolution. Not only does any sense of closure provided by a single story's ending immediately give way to the start or middle of another narrative in the midst of column after column of densely packed type, but an individual reader might also miss certain installments, leaving theoretically settled narratives as open questions. Even for the most disciplined of readers who followed each narrative from start to finish, the common practice of rereading, both alone and with friends and family, and you can see some sort of traces of the way that we can tell publications were sort of well-loved and well-read, offered the possibility of returning to and dwelling with the most exciting, frequently the queerest sections of the stories. For what remains nearly constant across a wide array of story papers is a valorization of a rough and tumble cast of working class characters who break convention, seduce and deceive other characters and the readers, and very frequently have the last laugh. In, quote, facilitating forms of class desire and identification, Laurie Marish argues that these papers offered to their eager readers a wide range of possibilities for transgressive working class female heroism. To take up one issue of a story paper as an example, the June 17th, 1854 edition of the Olive Branch presents content ranging from a fictionalized account of Aaron Burr's sexual exploits and an editorial about the ill treatment of the poor to Canadian travel logs and marriage announcements. Although it would be easy to identify a conservative strain running throughout the paper, the condemnation of Burr for his sexual proclivities, the advice columns that rely on clearly delineated gender roles, the rhapsodic sentimentalism of the poem My Wife and Child, I'm more interested in dwelling with the queer moments that run aslant such normalizing discourses and considering how a reader, a fannish reader, who prioritized those moments might allow them to inflect future readings and rereadings, revealing new meanings where they might not have been quite so visible before. On the back page of this issue, for instance, a short story appears from Winnie Woodfern, a regular story paper contributor. Fame versus Love, A Woman's Choice recounts the story of an unnamed first-person narrator as she gazes down upon a military parade and reflects on her, quote, queer, happy childhood, full of cross-dressing adventures and imaginary battles, riding a barrel-turned steed and striking with a carving knife at a spinning wheel enemy. A practice that evokes a, quote, odd, pleasurable feeling that not even the timidity of incipient womanhood could check or destroy. I want to pause briefly here just to note that my use of she, her pronoun shouldn't be taken as foreclosing trans interpretations of this story. I personally read Fame versus Love as a story very much about capacious gendered imaginings, other ones that may not coalesce back into contemporary rubrics of identity, but for the sake of an oral presentation in which the pronouns can't really be marked visibly and destabilized with, say, defamiliarizing italics, I'll follow Woodfern's lead in retaining the text's existing grammar. Within the story, as the military parade draws nearer, the narrator recognizes her uncle's beloved commander, a figure given his own queer backstory with the uncle through a short tale within a tale. And mere minutes later, she receives a written entreaty from the commander who's glimpsed her through her window, followed by a personal visit and an impromptu marriage proposal. Abandoning the cousin Juan, whom the narrator had once loved, she allows her suitor to disguise her as his brother in boy's armor, an experience that pleases her so deeply she begs to remain attired as such even after their voyage. When war breaks out in the commander's homeland, the narrator, having, quote, forgotten her sex and its fears, commands her own troops until she is struck down in combat, the last soldier standing. Cradled in her husband's arms on the battlefield, bloodied and on the verge of death, the narrator makes one final request: to be granted the rank of lieutenant. And then, as an afterthought, to have a lock of her hair and her bloodied sword sent back to Juan as an apologetic love letter that she trusts he will understand. Like most story paper fiction, though, the final lines, marked here in the small purple box, attempt to resolve the unruly pleasures that have flourished throughout. With her dying breath, the narrator wakes, safe at home, and pledges renewed devotion to Juan, deciding that, quote, the calm glory of love is far more beautiful than the fitful meteor of fame. Now, it hardly requires particularly close attention to catch the strains of gender transgression, transgender euphoria, and queer desire in Fame versus Love. I want to focus, though, on this text as a kind of looking glass that inflects the vision of those readers who care to take it up. What queer traces might the possibilities glimpsed in Woodfern's story make legible in the surrounding texts for a too close reader willing to return again and again until the pages crease, page creases wear thin, ink smudging beneath eager hands? Much like endings immediately give way to beginnings and middles on these crowded periodical pages, so too, I suggest, do queer possibilities leach out beyond the bounds of single stories. Like the juxtapositional logic Alexis Lothian describes Stanvids as facilitating, creating new context for otherwise unrelated scenes, the material conditions the material form rather, of the story paper facilitates forms of contiguous contagion that allow new interpretations to be offered and new questions to be asked of neighboring texts. Remaining within the pages of this issue of the Olive Branch, might we consider what possibilities a story like Fame versus Love could have offered to those Spanish readers most willing and wanting to find them? The ungendered you of the front page story Squeezing Hands, for instance, now opens space not only for cross-gender identification, but also for queer desire, as the grammar makes available as imagined potential lovers to all readers, both the man whose, quote, arms are entwined around you, and the lady who, quote, may twine her arms around your waist, press a kiss on your brow, toy with your fingers to your heart's content. Even that most sentimental, conventional of poems, My Wife and Child, which flows directly into Fame versus Love on the last page seen here, finds itself brought under new scrutiny through the story paper's juxtapositional logic. The single line of ink that divides the two pieces becomes little more than a fault line, and the most conventional fiction is made susceptible to the queer rumblings on the other side. After all, the poem's final lines, quote, my wife and child, I sigh to say, are yet, alas, are yet to be, reveal it to have been as much of a fantasy as Woodfern's narrator's cross-dressed martial glory, thereby collapsing the distance between the two visions, presenting both as inhabitable desires. I will leave that story paper behind for now and sort of offer you a brief summary, but ultimately, like contemporary fans, 19th century readers, particularly working class and female consumers, were frequently critiqued for their immersive readerly practices, for the way they allowed themselves to be swept up in texts, perverting their understanding of reality. Yet this too closeness may have offered a mode of queer textual subject formation in which they, like the characters on the story paper's pages, contracted the habits of their eccentric little friends. And for scholars, modeling such granular attention to texts rarely deemed worthy of it might allow us to better recognize and draw out traces of queer lives that fall aslant wealthy white histories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. That was fantastic. So Esther, if we can turn off the recording now.